we're going to try to work that out. But in the meantime, we'll have Joe talk to us, and really appreciate his willingness to change the batting order here a little bit. Thanks, Joe. And let's get a headset on you, okay?
I guess so. No, I bring no good news. I bring no good news. Let's go.
Our next speaker will be Joe Limkuller.
All right, well, thank you, Art. Full disclosure, yesterday afternoon was a critical moment. I had to make a decision to work on my presentation or go have drinks with Willie. Toby Keith wrote a song called I'll Never Smoke Weed with Willie Again. I will drink bourbon with Willie again. But I'll let you be the judge of what happened yesterday as I go through my presentation. So what I want to cover is oil, gas, and renewables and what happens going forward. So I'm the Chief Operating Officer of Beacon Offshore Energy. We're a startup, and it's an interesting time to start a deepwater oil company. But we've been around for 2.5 years, and our production is already in the top 10 for the Gulf of Mexico. And I suspect on an energy basis, I think we outproduce in 2 years Bloom Energy already. So looking forward, things I'm going to cover here is take a look at the global overview. We'll look at renewables, oil and gas. I'll give you my insights, and we'll look at the current trends. And we'll contrast that with the UN climate goals and ask the basic question, can we get there from here? Then we'll look at domestic U.S. energy, both from a production as well as consumption standpoint. And then I'll do a deep dive into climate emissions goals in reality, and how do we get there, and can we get there? And then look at some projections from 2021, just for the next 4 or 5 years, for wind, solar, oil, and gas. And what are the actual physical implications an engineer would look at if you are charged with the project manager to make this thing work. And then I'll give you my final thoughts from an engineering perspective. These are my thoughts. This does not represent Beacon at all. I don't have the company logo on here. Right now, we're on the cusp of some major fundings for some major projects that will totally transform us as a company. And we're under tremendous pressure from the ESG, environmental, social, governance aspects of acquiring funding, getting the banks and the capital markets to fund your operations. You have to show that if you're going to produce hydrocarbons, you're doing it in a manner that has a lower carbon footprint than other areas they could potentially invest in. It is becoming extremely difficult to justify continued funding of hydrocarbon projects, but I hope it's still possible, and I think it will be. But looking at global energy production, it's an interesting mix. This is where we were in 2018 on a global basis. That's the latest year I could get the information from. It came from the IEA, the International Energy Administration, and a lot of my other data comes from the US EIA, Energy Information Association. It's a rather interesting data set. Crude oil is the largest producer of energy in the world, followed by coal, natural gas, nuclear, biofuels, that's basically wood, and in the US, ethanol, hydro, and wind and solar. That's where we were on a global basis. So still entirely dominant on hydrocarbons, and 98% still comes from conventional energy. Joe's definition of conventional energy is that which had existed when I was in junior high. 18.5% is what I would call local. That's nuclear, biofuel, hydro, wind and solar. Tends to not cross international boundaries. There's no global trade in it, versus global energy of crude and coal, and now with LNG, natural gas. So why should you care about global energy? Well, President Biden has put us back into the Paris Agreement. It is a legally binding international treaty on climate change. Although never passed by the U.S. Senate, I guess the lawyers could argue over whether or not it truly is legally binding. But its goal is to limit global warming to less than 2, preferably 1.5 degrees Celsius. And to achieve this, companies need to have long-term reaching global, limit the peaking of greenhouse gases as soon as possible. I think soon as possible is probably at least maybe years, perhaps even a decade away. So what does that all mean to you? At the end of the day, what it means is to achieve the Paris Accords, local renewable energy must replace global hydrocarbons on a massive scale. So how big is that scale? Taking a look at global energy production trends, the first thing you notice is the consistency of the slope, and it's upward. Crude is up, coal, natural gas. Here's the main categories, and the only categories truly of energy, and I'll get into that in a minute. And then wind and solar. And you can see the incremental relative portions of each. And what's fascinating is that right now, on an annual growth rate from 2010 to 2018, on a global basis, the growth rate is 2.1%. We commonly don't think of 2.1% as a big number, but on a compound basis, on a global scale of energy budget, it's huge. Crude oil is up 1.3%, totally almost led entirely by the United States. Coal is up 3.1%, even though it's significantly down in the U.S. You take the downward trend in the U.S., the upward trend in the global basis outside the U.S. is even more. Natural gas is up 2.7%. Nuclear, there really aren't any appreciable new nuke facilities going in anywhere in the world, so it's flat. Biofuels are up, but I think the chances of additional increases is extremely limited. Hydro is up because the Chinese are still building dams, but elsewhere in the world they're actually taking them out. And wind and solar is up a staggering 9.6%. But as I presented last year, a big increase in a tiny amount is still tiny. So that's where it sits. The goal is to peak or reduce hydrocarbons. The challenge is globally, all energy sources are increasing, and on a volume basis, especially hydrocarbons. So just to stop the growth rate would be the first thing, let alone see a reduction or a peaking. I actually feel it's years, perhaps even decades away at best. And the goal of carbon neutral, you still need to have a massive replacement of oil, gas, and even biofuels, which currently makes up 90% of our energy. So a huge challenge on a global basis to achieve these targets. So now let's take a look at projections going forward. What does that look like? Well, in each of those categories, you got to do what an engineer does when you project your project out. You got to make some assumptions. So my assumptions is that solar and wind will grow at 13.5% versus 12% over the last 3 years. And as it grows, maintaining that gets to be a tremendous challenge. Because when you go from 1 to 2, that's an increase of 50%. But 2 to 3 is the same volume increase, but it's a less percentage increase. You're down to 33%. So when you work out the math, 12.5% is still a huge rate of growth in solar and wind. In hydro, I think its growth is pretty much limited. I think it's diminishing. So I'm going to assume a 1% growth versus 2.4% because I think even the Chinese are going to run out of sufficient hydro sites. Biofuels, I think the growth there will be 1.25%, which is what it's been over, I'm assuming 1.5%. It's been 1.25 over the last few years. I just think the world no longer has the wood to burn or the tolerance for taking down more wood for fuel. Nuclear is flat. I think a lot of plants are actually approaching the end of life in their facilities. So we can't expect any more fuel from there. Hydrocarbons, for the sake of argument, let's say that we can actually achieve and go flat as soon as possible. Let's keep it flat for the next decade up to 2030 and then go into decline. Natural gas, flat until 2030, and then decrease around 5% per year. Coal, flat, and then the war on coal will resume with a decline to 10% per annum afterwards. Oil, just so we can transition, let's keep it flat until 2030 and then decline at 5%. Wood demand, let's keep it at 1%, a little bit less than what has been increasing recently. And then 2.1% for the last 18 years. The EIA estimates about 1.5% decline. Let's assume 2.1. All of those, I think, are really rosy projections. They would be a hell of a challenge to meet. So what does that look like? You are here. Here's what it looks like. Solar and wind have got to pick up the pace. Even at those projected rates of increase, you have a huge gap if you have global energy increasing at just 1% per year. That's a heck of a gap. So I've decided to rename GAP to a different acronym. I think it needs to be known as Generally Applied Pixie Dust. You can only get here if you can fill the gap. So even Microsoft has come out with an admission that their corporate climate goals can only be met if we depend upon technology that not only has not been identified yet, but it simply doesn't exist. Let's go back to David's unicorn slide earlier this morning. So that's the global. I just don't see how you can get there from here. There's a huge gap to fill. So domestic energy. What's it look like for the United States? Well, the Biden administration, in the campaign, he said, day one, we're going to rejoin the Paris Accords. So how does the Paris Accords agreement work? Well, implementation of the agreement requires economic and social transformation. Ooh, that don't sound too good. Based on the best available science, the Paris Agreement works on a 5-year cycle of increasingly ambitious climate actions carried out by countries and nationally determined contributions. Boy, this seems a little vaguely familiar. Where have I heard this? So I went and I Googled 5-year plans and 5-year cycles, and oh, look at this came up. Initially used by the Soviet Union as part of their economic growth model and implemented by Joseph Stalin. Okay, this is starting to feel familiar. Okay, back to President Biden now. And he has set the existing goal to create a carbon pollution-free power sector by 2035 and a net zero emissions economy by no later than 2050. And we have many tools available to work with in the civil society, the private sector, state, local, and tribal governments. So what it really means is that by 2035, 100% of our electricity will come from carbon-free sources. And by 2050, we'll be at a net zero carbon emissions. Interesting. So let's take a look at global versus U.S. energy trends. The global economy is still expanding. Energy demand and consumption continues to grow as more societies leave the third world behind. However, the U.S. is a very developed economy, and energy growth is directly tied to economic trends. So to look at that, I pulled up one of my favorite charts. This is the EIA website. They do this every year. I love this chart. It's energy flow. And engineers love systems. How much do I put in? What do I get out? So we have production. You can see all the various things. I don't know if you can read it, but we've got coal, natural gas, crude oil, nuclear, all the power sources coming in. We've got imports. We still got a decent amount of imports, predominantly crude oil. Then we've got our exports. Exports are really growing up. So you'll see what that looks like in a minute. And then we've got consumption, what we consume. So there's the whole entire energy balance, the energy flow in the U.S. I pulled up every chart for the last 20 years, pulled the data off, and put that into trends so we can look at what's going on in each of the energy classification areas. So you can see crude oil. You can see the tremendous ramp up in crude oil as the United States, once again, by late 2019, became the largest crude oil producer in the world. You can see coal and the continuing diminishing role of coal as a result of the war on coal. Natural gas is up, nuclear, biofuels, hydrogen, wind, and you ready? Drum roll, solar. There it is. Let me do it again. There it is. There's solar. So it's interesting. The only thing that has enabled us to become dominant in crude oil production, and President Trump defined dominant as producing at a level that allows us to be a net exporter and influence global markets. And you can see the overall trend in dropping crude oil prices prior to the COVID crash, and then the subsequent recovery that was certainly achieved. So that is certainly at risk if we actually outlaw or restrict fracking to increase our crude oil production. The war on coal continues. Natural gas is up, but natural gas is only up for one reason. That's also hydraulic fracturing. Nuclear, I got a question. Is it sustainable as our plants reach the end of the usable life? And I don't have any hope of a new nuclear plant being permitted and approved in the U.S. Biofuels have energy density challenges. You take a look at the total energy and the density that's used to generate ethanol, it's just not a winner overall from a climate change perspective and certainly not from an energy economics perspective. Hydro, there really aren't any more additional sites. That leaves us just two things in the basket, two levers to pull. That is wind and solar. And just to give you the size of the challenge in front of us, in the next 29 years, everything you see between the brackets has to be replaced in order to achieve the climate goals that we have set due to our nationally determined allotment and the Paris Accords. So energy production continues to increase. Due to oil and gas, hydrocarbons are up 74% since 2010 in the world's largest economy. That is still an achievement that kind of boggles your mind a little bit. So that's production. But we are a net exporter, so what about consumption? So here's the consumption trends taken from the energy flow diagrams. You can see for coal, natural gas, oil, net imports, which is an interesting graphic. You can see by the end of early in 2019, we became a net exporter of oil. We still imported a lot of oil, but we exported even more. So we went to a net exporter. And you can see the nuclear trends there as well. So you can see that I mentioned that U.S. energy consumption is really more economy related rather than societal growth enabled. So in 2008, we had the economic crash and frack oil was just starting. In 2009 to 2012, we had an extremely weak economic recovery. So energy use actually still stayed on a downward trend. But starting in 2012 to 2019, we actually were seeing a 1% per year energy increase up until the decline associated with COVID. So even in the United States, it would be a challenge for us to stay energy flat. So for the last 8 years, these are the growth trends. Coal is down 10%, natural gas is up 6%, oil is up 8.2%. Imports have been the net imports have been totally eliminated. Nuclear is steady, biofuels are steady, hydro is down a little bit, some dams are being taken out, as I mentioned earlier, and wind is up 12.7%, and solar is up 35%. So this is what I think a lot of folks are banking on. They see those numbers on a percentage basis, but they have no concept of scale. So to say that, oh, geez, we just maintain that growth rate and that will be good, it would be good, but I just don't see it. You just can't get there from here. So let's go ahead and for the nation, let's project out what we think is going to happen. So I'm going to show you that what's the actual last 8-year trend, what I project in the next 8 years, and then after that. So I'm going to go even more optimistic in the U.S. than I did globally and say that solar can grow at a 15% growth rate for the next 8 years, which would be huge if you can find the stuff to build it. And we'll go over that in a subsequent slide. And then post-2030, let's go to 10%. It's high growth rates, and I got my questions about whether it's actually scalable. Same thing for wind. Right now, we're projecting 12.7%. There's tremendous ambitions and plans on wind. We'll look at that in detail in subsequent slides. But right now, I think 13% on wind would be amazing, and then 10% afterwards. Hydro, I just see it flat. I think we'll be doing well to even keep it flat. Geothermal, I just don't see it as viable, not long term. There's an awful lot of challenges with geothermal energy. One of the hottest wells that was ever drilled in the oil industry was called the Joseph well. And it was a well I drilled when I was at Shell. It had a bottom hole temperature of 457 degrees. The challenges were immense, and the thermal cycling on the materials is a tremendous challenge. And proper siting of geothermal sites is also an issue, so I just don't see growth here. I could be wrong, but I don't see it. And if there is any growth, it's going to be minimal. Same thing with biofuels. You take a look at what it takes to actually grow corn ethanol. The carbon footprint you get for the value of the energy you actually obtain is I don't see that as a winner. We're not going to burn more trees. We're not going to build any more nuclear plants. Oil imports, for sake of argument, if none of this works and we have to do something quick, we could always go to the import market. So that's going to be something that we'll use to fill the gap. For the purpose of this exercise, increased imports will be the generally applied pixie dust. And then our produced oil. I think oil is going to decline 5% per year for the next 8 years, and then 10% after that. Because I think what I'm starting to feel is that we're seeing, just like we did in coal, a war on oil. Natural gas liquids, not so much, because it's seen as a much more beneficial fuel from a carbon footprint as oil. And coal, I think the easy plants to shut down with no significant impact on our grid have done. And further shutdown of coal plants, I think, will have a huge impact. I saw some insights into that, what we saw last winter in Texas. So those are my projections. And I think it'd be great if we could hold it flat. But we're also growing as a country, unfortunately, predominantly through immigration. And the projections that are out there from the U.S. Census Bureau is by 2050, there will be 50 million more people in the United States. So for sake of argument, let's say that we can, through efficiency measures, the amount of energy we'll need will stay the same. So that's what the projections look like. The total U.S. energy use stays flat as the population increases 50 million. Might be a little optimistic. Coal is killed by its carbon footprint. Natural gas is steady for 10 years via fracking, with the supporting higher natural gas price. Natural gas prices are already double what they were a year ago. Natural gas is sitting at close to $4 per 1,000 cubic feet. Heating bills, they will be screaming this winter. Your oil production at reduced drilling and natural decline curves, and we'll take a look at that, what that means, is going to require us to increase imports. And according to this projection, which I feel is rosy, oil imports will go back by the end of this decade.
Okay, I see your ceiling
back
measure.
to the record oil imports we were at the worst of our dependence on OPEC.
Audio. Oh, there.
If
Maybe you're
we use it to fill the gap. Wind would have to grow from 3 quadrillion BTUs to 50 quadrillion BTUs per year and get that done in 30 years. And I've got some slides projecting what does that look like. And solar will grow from 1 quad to 25 quads in 38 years. What does that look like? Well, let's go take a look. A few things to consider. You know, Dave already mentioned when they tried to build the data farm in Delaware that, are you crazy, a data farm on solar and wind? It's intermittent. All right, this is all stored on random access memory that requires electricity to keep the computer up and running and warm. It has to stay online. If it goes down, you have to reboot. So backup and storage systems are needed. And none of these other solutions are there for us. So hydrocarbons will be called upon to fill a gap due to TINA. I love TINA. TINA is an acronym. It stands for There Is No Alternative. No hydro, no nuclear, biofuels are not going to respond. It's TINA. There is no alternative. We're going to have to use hydrocarbons to fill the gap. So how does that play into the climate emissions and goals and reality? How do we get there? I think it's time to take a look as an engineer looks at it. And this is what the public fails to recognize, and that's the difference between power and energy and the challenge of energy density. But they're going to actually see it and live it if we go down this path really quick. So there's the balancing act. We want to use less hydrocarbons. We want more renewable energy and zero carbon emissions. Yay, but there's a cost. Money. It's going to cost you. There's going to be increased surface infrastructure. We'll take a look at that. And an increased change in your lifestyle. Because if you want more of this, this is going to go, I want more of this, this is going to go up. So we're going to see increases in those areas. And what people fail to realize is there's a difference between energy sources and actual applications, generating power to get what engineers call work. We get our energy from only two places. We get it from the earth or we get it from the surface. That's all we have. We take oil out of the ground, we take gas out of the ground and coal. We even get uranium, the fuel for our nuclear facilities, out of the ground, and geothermal. On the renewable side, we get solar from the sun on the surface. We do burn biomass, and we have photovoltaic solar. We can harness the wind, we can harness the tides, and we can harness hydroelectric. There are no other energy sources. That's it. That's what we have. Then there's applications and utilization. We burn it. We direct burn it for transport in our planes, trains, and automobiles. We use it to heat our homes, cook our meals, run our houses, and power our industries via the internal combustion engine. Or we convert it to electricity. That's the rage right now. We're going to go to a total electric economy. Okay, got it. So the grid is going to do everything. All right, it'll work for our industry, it'll work for our houses. We can store it in batteries. It'll help with our surface transport with electric vehicles. Aviation, no. It'll power a drone, but I'll show you in subsequent slides, due to the weight of the battery and the energy density and the mass of it, you are never going to fly a plane on solar, or you're never going to fly a plane on batteries any appreciable distance beyond a novelty. And then there's resistance heating, one of the most inefficient methods of heating, but that's where we're going to go. And then there's the storage issues. How do I store it? Well, I can store it via hydro. I can actually use spare electricity produced by renewables to get water pumped to higher elevation to supply hydro. I can get it from hydrogen. But as David alluded to earlier, hydrogen is nothing more than a transformation of energy. And there are only two sources from it. We'll take a look at that as we go forward. Either get it from hydrolysis or you get it from natural gas. And tremendous amounts of energy are needed to get to the hydrogen. So you just can't drill for hydrogen. You have to actually create it from materials that are on the earth, predominantly water and natural gas. So the cool thing about oil, gas, and coal, it services both of those sectors. Nuclear and geothermal, though, can only be converted to electricity. And everything we have from surface energy only goes to electricity. And you can get biomass. We can burn wood to heat our homes and whatnot, but given the population density of the earth, I don't recommend it. It's pretty minor. But to transport our planes and our trains and our automobiles and industrial power, I just don't see renewables playing a role. That's a gap. That's a huge challenge in my view. And oh, by the way, if we're going to get rid of gas, right now 40% of the electricity in this country comes from natural gas generation. So that's a tremendous amount of replacement that needs to occur. And that brings the question, can renewable energy provide the power for industry and transport? Power. It's a word that's used interchangeable with energy, but power is how much energy power density is how much energy can be converted to power from a volume, area, or mass. A good way to think about it is this way. It's the energy flow that can be captured from a given unit volume or mass of material. So the flowing water, the jug is kind of like renewable energy. There is a lot of it. I just can't get it very fast, and the cup is power. The cup provides more power, and that's what we need to run things. Renewable energy is vast and abundant. It's just not very powerful. It'll take vast amounts of land and resources to replace our current power to deliver work that we need to run our society. So there's some interesting papers that are out there. This one I found very interesting, which estimates that renewable energy sources take up 1,000 times more space than that of fossil fuels. I didn't have time to put a slide in, but I work with NOIA, the National Ocean Industries Association. I chair the HSE committee. And we did a study and we looked at the deep water offshore production of the country. 80% of the oil that comes from offshore comes from facilities that, when put back to back, occupy 7 city blocks. I'm going to show you a whole lot more than 7 city blocks for the windmills it will take. And when you look at it from an infrastructure basis, the power density of watts per meter squared, you can see natural gas, oil, and coal. This is Art Berman put this together. It's an impressive slide. You can't even see the amount of power you get from the equivalent area of solar, wind, and biomass. So what does that really mean? It means that the energy transition from hydrocarbons to renewables will require sacrifice, something this society struggles with. Up to 1,000 times the infrastructure footprint. And in a culture that's dominated by not in my backyard, are we going to be willing to tolerate the transition? I have my doubts. So let's take a look at wind. Here's the wind power trends. U.S. onshore, we generate 3 quadrillion BTUs of wind. Globally, 15.31. And you can see the growing offshore sector is at 0.9 quads. So the total amount of global wind energy created today, this year, is 19.2 quadrillion BTUs. For reference, the U.S. economy goes through 121 quads of energy a year. So that's where wind is. What's the future potential impact? So the scenario I presented to you, I thought was really rosy. It's optimistic. I'm trying to make it as easy as possible to see a pathway to get to use wind. So we need to go from 3 to 50 quads by 2050. How do you do that? Well, you do the math because you're an engineer. So I need 47 quadrillion quads of delivered power. And you can actually research this from the EIA's website. It's 39.4 gigawatts of wind power capacity is needed for every quad delivered. And this is where people kind of lose it a little bit in the details. A wind power has a rating. Let's say, oh, this is a 1 gigawatt wind farm. Awesome. That's the capacity. The truth is, it's down a lot. It doesn't always operate at the wind doesn't always blow at the optimum speed. It actually has a capacity factor of 1/3. So you have to take all those numbers and divide by 3 to come up with what's actually delivered of electrons into your house to help run the electricity for the things you want to do. So that gets you to 1,640 gigawatts per year, which is a whole lot of megawatts. And the Union of Concerned Scientists has done a study, and they have said that wind energy uses up to 141 acres per megawatt of wind capacity, because we converted everything into capacity numbers here, and that gets you 231,212,000 acres. Oh boy. Or 361,000 square miles. How much is that? Well, let's take a look. So I pulled up a table of land area of every state in the country, and I applied my engineering analysis to determine that that would be 50% of California, Oregon, and Washington. Half of those states. And I only want to burden the coastal areas. I don't want to burden into eastern Oregon, eastern Washington, or interior California with something the people on the coast wouldn't say they love to have. It would be 100% of New York, New Jersey, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, and Maine, because they want it, although the people at Block Island are already objecting to the Block Island wind farm off Rhode Island. We're just getting started. 100% of Delaware, Maryland, and Virginia. And Florida doesn't want any offshore drilling, so certainly you must love wind, so we'll give the rest to you. That'll take up 80% of Florida. Will the not-in-my-backyard coastal populations tolerate such an impact? Probably not. Because they also said, well, you're not going to be able to see it. Well, okay. I live in New Orleans. I live north of Lake Pontchartrain. It is a 24-mile wide body of water. I drive across it often, and I can often see the skyscrapers, One Shell Square, from the North Shore, 28 miles away. I can see it fine when there's a low humidity day, which occurs about 4 times in Louisiana. But that's a 500-foot story building. This kind of blew my mind when I saw this graphic through NOIA, is the evolution of wind turbines and what is happening onshore and what is planned for the offshore, the view shed. Get your mind around some of this. There's the Statue of Liberty. You can see the big circus wheel in London, the Gherkin building in London. These are for offshore structures. The Eiffel Tower and an 82-story floating office building offshore. I've got some concerns with this. I've lived through Category 4 and Category 5 storms hitting my facilities. I've had my rig totally topple and go into the bottom of the Gulf of Mexico. I know what these things take. I know that the design factors that are used by the engineering are extremely optimistic. This is what happens when Katrina took a jack-up rig. This is put it right offshore, Dauphin Island, Alabama. And this is the Mars tension leg platform, the largest producing facility in the Gulf of Mexico. It got hit by Katrina, 202-mile-an-hour winds, 74-foot seas. It is a floating tension leg platform, and I guarantee you the stability of this far exceeds anything they're considering on wind. So this has a total height of 310 feet, and you guys want to go to 800. Okay. So I got some concerns about that one. So let's take a look at solar. Same thing, same analysis. We need to go from around 1 quad a year to 25 quads. That's an additional 25 quads of power. It's 8.9 acres per milliwatt for solar. Convert capacity over into actual production. That gets you 34, same thing, gigawatts per quad. Now we're dealing with gigawatts of solar power, megawatts of solar power. Solar at a 20% capacity factor for solar, 8.9 acres per megawatt. It's a lot of land, folks, that's going to go into solar panels. 58,000 square miles, or the entire state of Illinois. I thought we would bless Chicago with some of the fun, too. So already, you can see in the press, people are realizing it. In Louisiana, some of the solar plants that they have pushed back, a lot of concern. And you read through the article here, the farmers are saying, wait a minute, look at all the subsidies you're granting to solar. I got to compete against that? You want to take my sugarcane field and turn it into a solar plantation? A lot of concern over that. On Tuesday, I attended a seminar with Senator Murkowski and other leaders in our government, and the subject was critical minerals, which is the lifeblood of renewables. It's key to vital industries, and there's concern. There are 35 critical minerals, there they are, that the U.S. federal government has identified as critical to our economic survival and our economy. And we are dependent on 31 out of the 35 because we import more than half of what we use. And on 14 of those minerals, we import 100%. So there's an awful lot of concern. How does this go forward? I was really surprised to see barium sulfate on there. Barium sulfate is absolutely key and critical to the drilling industry. It is the weighting agent we use in our drilling fluids so we can ensure we can drill safely without any kind of a blowout. Without barium, barite, we don't drill. So it's interesting. And I know we import tremendous amounts of our barite because you just can't get a new barite mine permitted in the United States. So it's interesting. These are some notes I took from the conversation. This was presented by Senator Murkowski. China is the world's powerhouse in both mining and processing of critical minerals. They are positioned to achieve total vertical integration in the renewable energy raw materials supply chain. They control 80% of not only the actual product, but the world's refining capacity for critical minerals. They are the OPEC of critical minerals. Can the U.S. challenge China and domestically supply our own renewables? In a word, no. It takes 12 years to permit a mine in the U.S. We actually, in our plans, we have an over-dependence and over-reliance on recycling. And Reuters has noted that we need to rely on Canada to become the 51st state for a domestic renewable energy raw material supply chain. And keep in mind that critical minerals from outside the U.S. utilize inadequate and unacceptable environmental standards. My last visit to Beijing, I spent a lot of time looking out the window. The plane flew north, it kind of goes over Alaska, then drops down into the U.S. And I was shocked at the landscape that I was seeing out of the plane. and the amount of disruption strip mining for rare earth metals does in China. You get a feel for the scale of things when you're in a plane. And I Googled and looked up, what am I looking at? And it was the rare earth mineral mines in China. So that's a concern. In the words of Senator Murkowski, we need a rapid, rational, clear-headed approach to the mining of these minerals. But right now, even a start on that effort is tied up in the current infrastructure bill. So I haven't read the bill they've supposedly agreed upon, but I'll be interesting to see if there's anything that accelerates the permitting of mining, or did that get tossed out in the compromise for developing the legislation. General Motors then came on, and the lead technical officer at General Motors communicated that they are fully committed to a 100% electrical vehicle fleet, but the average American electric vehicle uses 6 times the critical minerals a conventional internal combustion vehicle. You'll note aluminum is listed on there as a critical mineral. GM, which would be bauxite. GM plans to make the batteries in the U.S., but they need the raw materials. I'll tell you what, without feedstock, dude, you're not making anything. The supply must be sustainable and cost competitive. That starts to sound like another application of generously applied pixie dust. The Audubon Society came on, and they said that, in their view, 2/3 of the world's species will be extinct without climate change actions. That massive wind and solar facilities should be sited in areas with limited impact. Like California, Washington, or New York? It's great to have a collaborative process to protect sensitive ecosystems and focus on areas with high potential and low impact. Those, to me, in engineering land, sound like mutually exclusive events. So really, where are these places? So everything right now, it just feels like jargon, it feels like buzzwords, and is anybody actually looking at maps, figuring out areas, and figuring out what sacrifices are going to have to be made? We've heard a lot of talk about hydrogen. Oh gosh, that's the fuel of the future. It's a fuel. It's not an energy source. There is no free lunch. This is a great chart prepared by the EIA. It's a comparison of energy content per unit volume and then energy content per unit weight. And there's something we all know and familiar with and hopefully love, gasoline. And you can see here's where hydrogen is. Energy conversion is not new energy. Hydrogen is plentiful. Water comprises 71% of the planet's surface, but it takes energy to get the hydrogen from either water or natural gas. And the electrolysis process, the DOE estimates, costs are going to have to drop 80% from $5 per kilogram of hydrogen to just $1 for it to be competitive. Well, how do you do that when energy prices are set to skyrocket for electricity? Okay, let's get it from natural gas. Well, to get it from natural gas, you have to create supercritical steam. It takes energy to get the water hot to develop it that way. Hydrogen is nothing more than an energy conversion process. The electrons must come from somewhere. And if you elect to store it in batteries, batteries are incredibly heavy. At 1,200 pounds, a battery alone makes up 23% of the weight of an electric vehicle. For passenger cars, and now I see Ford come out with the full electric F-150, you got to supply the energy to haul around your energy, which now weighs 1,800 pounds. So look at it from a thermodynamic standpoint, solar planes and solar cars, they just won't fly, in my opinion. So there's hydrogen. Compressed hydrogen supplies a tremendous amount of energy per unit of mass, but it's not very dense. And even if you take a look at the batteries are very dense, but they really don't supply much energy. So there's a challenge there. And then there's what I call the fiery considerations of using hydrogen for transport. Think about it. It's got 2.5 times, all right, the energy per unit mass is 2.5 times that of gasoline, but the energy per unit volume is 1/4 to 1/10 if you go with compressed gas or compressed liquid. And in practical terms, what we're saying is, I'm going to put a pressurized tank on my car that is 4 to 10 times larger than my gas tank that explodes with 2.5 times the force. David had a little insight into that. And I found this when I researched this picture, I found out, why did the Germans use hydrogen and not helium in the Hindenburg? Because the helium came from the U.S. and the U.S. refused to sell it to Hitler. So he went to hydrogen. So energy costs, they will rise considerably. This is the most recent data I could find from September 2020. I know you can't read it. I'll show you what each country is, but at the top is Germany at 38 cents per kilowatt hour. And you go through all the countries, and I decided to go research, well, what's their percentage of renewable energy in each of those countries? So this is the household electricity of those countries mapped against the percentage of electricity they get via renewable energy. And it's a pretty doggone good correlation. You can see Germany up here in the center, upper portion of the center of the graph at 38 cents. Denmark, Portugal, New Zealand, Ireland, the UK, Italy, Spain, Japan. And then you come down to the US, you see Russia. And what's fascinating is, the countries at the bottom are the ones that are heavily dependent upon hydrocarbons. The countries at the top, heavily dependent upon renewable energy. Put in a polynomial curve fit, and you come up with an R squared of 0.7. I was surprised it's that high. R squared is a statistical measure. It says, I'm going to put a line in and estimate, and how well does that line explain how the data changes? And in this case, 70% of your electric bill can be accounted for simply by what's the percentage of your electricity that comes from renewable energy. I didn't think the correlation would be that tight. I was really surprised. And you see, it seems to flatten out. It seems like, okay, as you ramp up, once you get ramped up, you're going to pay a heavy price. But it might be economic going forward, at least in terms of additional cost. So it's a fascinating graph, but I don't see any way you're going to get ahead. You see a lot of things in the news about, oh, renewable energy, it's coming down, it's cheap. Well, as they say in the SEC, when they talk about investment, past performance is not indicative of future results. It might be better, but it could also be worse. And I'll show you some things in a minute. So here's where we are. Globally, we've got this projection. You are here. Globally, even under a rosy projected scenario, unless the growth in energy demand stalls, and on a global basis, I don't see it happening, and especially as we recover from COVID, an increasing energy gap can only be filled by hydrocarbons. So let's take a look at oil and gas. Oil and gas have been demonized. We're told CO2 is an existential threat and pollutant. We got to be at net zero by 2035. Some countries say 2040. Some companies say 2050. But for the great transition to occur, we must fill the gap. Microsoft admits, I already mentioned this, that to meet their corporate energy goals, you got to find and develop technologies that don't even exist. That is Unicorn City in my view. Access to capital is a huge challenge. Banks are reluctant to fund, and the environmental social governance scorecard now rules most projects from a funding standpoint. Perception is reality, and the perception is negative on hydrocarbons. In the meantime, we've seen a lionization of the nobility of renewables. It is actually hope versus reality, and keep in mind, capacity does not equal production. So this is what's going on globally in terms of crude oil production. You can see the United States on the bottom. Here's what our decline curve would look like if we didn't have fracking. What's interesting is what's not on this list. What's not on this list is the country with the largest petroleum reserves in the world, Venezuela. Venezuela is currently number 21 and dropping like a rock. That is an indication of trying and relying upon the innovations of industry. When you take away capitalism and replace it with socialism, you get total destruction. Currently, the US and Canada serve to balance Russia and Saudi Arabia. But as we transition away from oil, we're turning over the oil markets to the Saudis and the Russians. And the impact of the war on oil will be Russian and Saudi dominance in hydrocarbons versus US dominance. I'll let you speculate on what the implications of that is. Another fascinating thing I saw was China. I know China has been trying desperately to ramp up their domestic oil production. They have not been successful. I thought they would at least be holding serve. They haven't. Their domestic production is down 10% over the last 5 years. I haven't studied the geology of China. I don't know if it's a geological problem or a technological problem. To a certain extent, it doesn't matter. You're the world's largest manufacturing-based economy that does real physical stuff, and your oil production is declining. So does that explain some rationale for why China is now making a big push offshore? They're expanding, they're putting in some massive offshore production facilities, and could that possibly explain China's current offshore aggression? Maybe it isn't military. Maybe it's a recognition they need to protect their hydrocarbon sources as best they can domestically. So I found that interesting. And then there's well, Joe, why don't we just leave it in the ground? All right, okay. What does pure decline look like? No additional wells. There's the chart. You can see we peaked in 2019, we're already declining. And keep in mind, onshore wells that are fracked, in the first year, the average production decline is 47%. If a well starts out at 1,000 barrels, a year later it's down at 470. 25% the next year, and then you can see the averages that I've used from the subsequent years. We have indications that that is indeed going to occur. You can see the drop in tight oil production in the Permian Basin in Texas, the drop due to COVID, and this is with rigs still running, so there's still replacement. This is not just pure natural decline. You can see in 2019 we went from over 8 million barrels, now we're down to below 7, and that's with replacement activity still continuing, but not at the level it needs to. Offshore oil, we averaged a 12% decline rate, and then it slows down, and we don't have near the decline that we have offshore. You apply that, and if we were to shut the rigs down, that's what would happen to our oil production, and I think that's optimistic. The bottom line is we have to keep drilling to add production, and we need additional production facilities to help manage the decline. So back to my scenario, that's the gap that we need to fill. Can we get investment to even fill the gap and rely upon the hope of renewables to supply everything else? We're still drilling, although at a very reduced rate relative to oil price. Onshore rig counts are increasing, but much slower than prior booms. I find this concerning. I think this may be our production profile going forward, and you can see the wedge imports would fill. So we're going to see a low rig count scenario as oil prices increase, or are we going to see a continued increasing rig count and constant oil prices? In aggregate, shale drillers in the United States in the last 10 years have lost $580 billion. It has added tremendous oil to our economy, tremendous oil to the global markets, but it's been done at a loss over the last 10 years, and it results in hesitant bankers and hesitant investors going forward. Couple that with the ESG pressure, and I've got concerns that we're going to see this one, not this one. So the headwinds against sustained, let alone increased oil and production development are considerable. Even the Republicans are moving to totally make the current offshore drilling bans permanent. Offshore wind is touted as the absolute solution, and the majors are totally shifting their focus away from oil. Exxon is committed to cut their workforce by 10% per year. The rig count is at 50% of the level needed to sustain production in 2019. There's your oil rig count right now. You can see oil prices have gone up tremendously. They've doubled. And we haven't even gotten back to where the rig count was when oil was at $50, let alone the current price of $74. The industry is not responding. Big oil has left the building, and this is an amazing statistic. Who is running the nation's oil rigs? We have half the rigs running we had before. Private equity. Private money is now driving the oil industry more so than public money. And small cap and mid cap companies, big oil, the one you see in green, is running 9% of the rigs in this country. So the branding transition, Total, the large French oil company, is now Total Energies. Statoil, national oil company in Norway, is now called Equinor. Is it real? Is it just a branding, or is it a substantial transformation? Things that shocked the markets was the ruling in the Dutch court that Royal Dutch Shell, by law, must reduce their emissions by 45% in the next 8 years. One of the largest private oil producers in the world has got to, by law, and you have to reduce the oil you produce because we're going to count the CO2 emissions from the people who use the product you sell. And Exxon recently had their board taken over by board members who are going to demand a transition of Exxon away from hydrocarbons. And the most interesting quote here is the increasing potential for ever more stringent investor, climate, and emissions-related investment thresholds are likely to yield higher capital costs, diminished access to capital for oil companies that do not keep pace with investors' expectations for transitioning to a low-carbon business model. We are now approving our projects based on how well they help the country move away from the product we produce. It is an interesting time. So what you're looking at is the activity is not there. Crude inventories are dropping. Prices are rising. And I don't see any end in sight. So enjoy your $3.50 gas. And I hope you can tolerate your $4.50 gas when we meet next year. Coal, interesting. Coal use is declining in the U.S., but is going up elsewhere around the world. Australia is getting their coal to market. Wyoming is the Saudi Arabia of coal, but yet they can't get approval to run their coal trains to the West Coast. So coal prices are at 10-year record highs. So prices are going up everywhere. And what's the response from a party in control of our government? Hey, let's place a ban on the most productive energy technology in the last 50 years. Let's introduce into the Senate from Senator Sanders and Senators Markley, Senator from Massachusetts. Help me out here, Willie. Markley. Hey, let's put a bill in there to ban fracking. That would be great. So domestic energy. Final slide, my view. As the global economy grows post-COVID, conventional energy will be in high demand and it will be dominated by hydrocarbons. Renewable energy output will continue to increase, but due to all the range of issues I've covered here, growth rates will slow due to scale and scope. We just don't have the materials, we don't have the infrastructure to scale up at a rate high enough to replace hydrocarbons and meet the Paris Climate Accord goals. Supply issues, and then the increased awareness of the environmental impacts of what's it really going to mean if we go to that much wind and solar, and I didn't even touch maintaining backup capacity. Rising prices. Conventional energy will struggle to meet demand. Hydro and nuclear, decades to increase production. Biomass is not scalable. And I don't think folks are accounting for the natural decline rate in hydrocarbons, the current low investment rate by the industry, and funding pressure from the non-government organizations. Rising prices will also be seen on renewables. As renewables try to sustain growth rates at scale, supply and demand imbalances will drive costs higher. Lithium prices are going through the roof. Banks are starting to investigate the lithium mines in Chile and South America for environmental compliance. They're starting to apply the same rigorous inspection and regulatory controls we live under to the renewables. I think we'll see pushback as the public has to deal with the consequences going to renewables and the virtue of renewables fades as people see their land being converted over into solar farms and wind farms, and then sustainability issues become publicly apparent, and the not in my backyard crowd starts to rule. Globally, China will rise in influence and economic power as the U.S. declines, and domestically, a politically polarized U.S. government and society struggles as the energy and transition encounters reality. Physics and engineering don't care about your agenda. Thanks.
In the tradition that a question becomes a statement, the problem you pose, of course, is not technological or engineering-wise. It's political.
Yep.
There are two political problems. One is the Paris Accords, which will never stand. Our last president tried to defeat them. They cannot stand. They represent, of course, the ban on hydrocarbons.
Yep.
The second political problem is the ban on nuclear energy.
Totally.
One or both of those political problems must be solved, or 1 billion people are going to die, because the remaining energy in the system, if those two political problems are not solved, will be split among those who can reach it, and the poorer part of people on the planet will not be able to reach it. Now, I believe the hydrocarbon problem, that political problem, can be solved. I hope so. The other thing, nuclear power, I think is underrepresented. In Oregon, in the Senate, 2 bills were presented this time. Both of those bills would allow the building of new-scale nuclear power plants in Oregon, as one is also being built in Idaho today. If those bills passed, Oregon would become Texas, because all of the power in Oregon from all systems could be replaced by nuclear power. In Asia, Russia and China have increased by 50% the amount of nuclear power they are building. So I believe the political problem for nuclear power can be solved. I believe the political problem on hydrocarbon power can be solved. And if we don't solve one or the other, we're going to lose 1 billion people because we won't have enough energy, and the lower classes in the world will not be able to demand enough energy to survive.
I totally agree with you, Art, and I hope you're right, and I hope I'm
The
wrong.
presentation's exceptionally good, but I wanted to point out that those political problems solve one of the two, or 1 billion people die.
Yep. Well, I was aware of those things, and I purposely left them out.
Thank you.
Because at the end of the day, I don't think anything's going to change until people actually have genuine suffering. Unfortunately, that's where I think we are. I think it's horrible. And I hope we're not there, but...
Okay, we'll have a few more questions, succinct questions, but, and then we do have Professor Calabrese ready. And just a note to him, because he can hear me speaking through this, I think, Professor, if you could start sharing your screen, working on sharing your screen and your slides, because we'll come to you next, and then we'll get to our next questioner.
Thank you, Jim. Joe, that was very good. I get a question on storage of wind.
Mm-hmm.
I've looked at capacities in King Island, off Tasmania. Public records are available, and on the Canary Islands, one island of the Canary Islands. Do you know any other efforts for proof of concept that you can store wind from using reliable energy? Pump storage in Virginia uses thermal energy, nuclear and coal-fired.
No, I'm not. I'm not aware of any. Other than batteries.
Joe, what a wonderful presentation. Thank you.
Oh, thank you.
All right. One of the things that you didn't cover in your talk, understandably, was projections as to what technologies might be available. Projections as to what technologies might be available in the future. As our first questioner mentioned, we're going to have to start using nuclear energy again,
Yep.
whether we like it or not. It's just going to happen. And there's a lot of new technology associated with nuclear for the rapid removal of nuclear waste by the use of re-irradiation. So, you know, there is science going on. There's also, you know, you weren't able to, I mean, you only have so much time. You weren't able to mention the new chemistry having to do with sequestering of CO2, the polymerization of CO2 from the atmosphere to make useful products. You know, there's many things. Biofuels, everything that you said is true for now. But again, there too is technology going on, and growing corn may not be the best way to produce biofuels. People are thinking about algae. They're thinking about other things. Okay, so there's a lot of science going on. I know that you weren't able to work that into your equation, and you can't because it's an unknown. So you presented...
That's the generally applied pixie dust category?
Excuse me?
That's the category I identify as generally applied pixie dust, the gap. Everything you said is all possible, but when you look at it from an engineering and a projects basis, the total carbon footprint of what you're proposing, I just, from a thermodynamic standpoint, I have my doubts.
And then, of course, we haven't talked at all about, you know, controlled thermonuclear fusion, if that should ever happen.
Yep.
So, you know, those are unknowns, but they're real in the sense that they could, at any time, yield a solution to the problem. So it's not...
Totally agree. Nuclear is absolutely the best possible, the most potential outside of hydrocarbons. But I still firmly believe right now, until some other breakthroughs occur, that's all we have.
And then, of course, there's high-temperature superconductors to reduce the electric loss during transmission of electric energy. So that's another future thing.
That just gets you 7%.
Yeah.
That's not the game changer we're looking for. The average transmission loss is 7%.
Thank you for that. It was very illuminating and scared the pants off me. Could you comment on the social upheaval that we might be facing when this mud hits the fan? The other side that is dreaming about 2035 and 2050 and postulating that we will magically get there, when they find out that we need to lose 15 states to solar farms and wind farms, and they decide we're not going to do that, and they have to burn oil, that's going to lead to frustration, animosity, anxiety, and social upheaval. They're going to find out it's pixie dust, and they're going to say burn oil. That's going to lead to some social upheaval. Can you comment on what's going to happen when they find out that what you're saying is true?
No. I'm an engineer.
Thank you.
No, I'm an engineer and who tries to be a manager. And all I can tell you is if history is any guide, the only persons that's probably going to be blamed for it somehow, some way is people like me.
That's as good an answer as I could expect, but there will be.
Oh, I think, yeah, there will be.
Well,
Societal impacts will be huge.
get a gun.
No comment. Last one.
Thanks so much for your presentation. I mean, I've heard some of these other arguments being made out here by our colleagues about what might be, what could be. But the point you made, which I think is very valid, is we have a government that's going to be in power for a while, mandating all these changes that you've illuminated.
Yep.
I'm wondering if we should be thinking of ways to inflict the pain on certain sectors more quickly. The thought comes to my mind that perhaps state governments could pass legislation that would say any industry that uses fossil fuels in any production and calls it renewable, is not renewable. I mean, windmills are produced using fossil fuels. They could say that all federal facilities in my state may no longer use fossil fuels.
There are politicians who would like to do that, yes.
And then you could say no federal government vehicle may be used if it uses fossil fuels. I mean, this would be a way to actually begin to put sand in the gears of the bureaucracy that is trying to kill 1 billion people.
Yeah.
By raising energy prices. What is your thinking about that? Being people who love liberty, of course, we need to be sensitive about that.
Yeah, I hear you, but I have no answers. I just don't.
Well, thank you again. That was
Okay.
a terrific presentation.
All right.
I guess I'm breaking protocol here. Was that the last question, or can I ask one more?
I'll let the referee.
All right, yeah, I have a brief question. I was actually at that Exxon shareholder meeting. There's a bunch of groups. I represent CFACT.
Okay.
And, but there's a bunch of us that bought shares for the purpose of trying to stave off what the Greens were doing at a number of BlackRock and Exxon and all these. I did have a question. You had said the ESG criterion
Correct.
is a big hurdle for you.
Yes.
I'm aware of many of them, what they have, but I'm wondering in particular, because a lot of them have nothing to do with energy. They are things like you need a board of diversity and all this. Are you finding any in particular? How are you playing that game so that you can get the loans to be able to go forward with some sort of capital project?
I'm trying to avoid it being a game, first of all.
But it is a game. They're not gonna give you the loan unless you do something. So I'm just curious.
No comment. What we are required to adhere to in our financing agreements is what's called the equator principles. And in there, we have to track and monitor, okay, as I go through the drilling process, the production process, installation of the facilities, how much carbon am I generating, what's my baseline, how does that contrast to other opportunities and other sectors in the industry who are doing the same thing, and what is your plan to have a constructive plan to reduce emissions, update your plan every year, and get that back to the banks. And I don't understand what the loan recall provisions are if I don't meet them. Because I find it hard to define the equator principles. I find it hard to find definitive baselines on comparative data that I would have confidence in. It feels a little bit like squishing Jell-O. So, all righty.
Oh, sorry. Thank you. Thanks. Yeah, we can go ahead and turn that off for now.